Welcome back to Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined with my co-host here, ExoAcademian. Exo, how's it going?
It's going well, my friend. Looking forward to tonight's episode. Always a highlight of my week when we get together to have these discussions.
Same here. And for those of you who don't know, I know we've said this before, but Exo and I feel really fortunate because not only do we get to do this show together, but we have the rare good gift of living nearby. So we actually can get together in person, and we try to do that every other week, the weeks when we're not recording. And eventually we're going to do, as the weather gets nicer, we're planning to do kind of an outdoor recording. So we'll use nature as our studio at some point and give that a try. Are you looking forward to that?
I am. And, you bringing this up reminded me of a couple episodes ago, we talked about synchronicity. I think this is a perfect example. I don't think it's a stretch to say that we both feel like each other are the best person to do this show with. And considering UFO Twitter is a global, cyberscape, the fact that we both live in the exact same area, within 20 minutes of each other kind of thing is pretty shocking. And I would say it's a synchronistic event for sure.
100% agree to that. So anyway, it's incredibly cool, and we've really had a great time with the show, and thank all of you for listening along and participating with us wherever you happen to listen to the show, whether that's on YouTube or your podcast platform of choice. So the topic for this week we have called Tools for Analysis. And when we talk about tools for analysis, we're going to take this through kind of a progressive journey on this episode. And initially, what I want to do is start by thinking about the ways in which you and I as individuals approach any experience that we have in our lives. And so how is it that we view and relate with experiences generally? What are the things that we bring to bear on those moments? And then as we go through the course of this episode, we're going to kind of widen the scope of tools that are used to evaluate experience from the narrow at the individual level to the broader kind of tools that we have heard about and see about in academia and in our culture sort of socially. So with that said, the kind of the first order things that I think about from perspective are the things that, and I'll speak only as myself here, the things that shape the way I look at the world and the way I look at experience. And these are factors that I had in many sort of ways zero control over whatsoever. So I was born in North America, United States. I'm a male. I'm a white male. I have a family. I was born into kind of a nuclear family, mom and dad and brothers and sisters. These are things that I didn't choose. I just, at least from one perspective, we can talk about others, but things that I just kind of stumbled into. The situation that our family had sort of economically, our stature within our society, all these things were things that just came along with me kind of arriving on the scene. And as you're a child and you grow up in whatever sort of set of conditions that you find yourself, it's not that you're going to class and they're telling you these kinds of things. You are absorbing them day in and day out through the interactions which you have with your parents or caregivers or your siblings if you have them, or your neighbors if you have them, or your school. You're just absorbing this content constantly, and these elements are reinforced or they are suppressed, or in some ways even eliminated, depending on the kind of environmental conditions that we find ourselves in. And so that, for me, is that individual perspective that in many ways, if we approach a situation, we can't readily even see it. It's almost like it's literally the lenses over our eyes not glasses, just the film and that we see things through. And we have to pause and sort of step back and think, okay, how am I looking at this, and how is it colored by these factors, of which many of which I had very little control over whatsoever. So that's how I think of it, as sort of like this inner individual perspective on lived experience generally. But Exo, I was kind of wanting to get your thoughts too on this. How do you view those things which are sort of instinctual or closely held, that form that hidden, in a way, a perspective of our lives?
Yeah, it's fascinating, and as you say, it's kind of insidious in a way because we're not aware of it usually. And prior to the 20th century, it wasn't even discussed really at all. It wasn't even recognized, and to a large degree, when the church kind of ruled the day, the notion was you were born into a certain experience in life because that's what God willed.
Mm.
And in some Eastern countries, India and whatnot, with a caste system, suddenly it was or sometimes it was you were born like this because of what you did in a previous lifetime, kind of thing. Some sort of notion of karma. So yeah, it was an important notion when this was recognized, that our lives are shaped by all of these factors that, as you say, from the typical perspective anyway, the conventional perspective, we have no control over. Where we're born, who we're born in, to, which families, which economies, which economic structures, which dominant religion is in place in the place you were born. I think one of the things that most struck me about fundamentalist Christianity, when I kind of saw it for what it was, is that it had so much in common with fundamentalist Islam. They have more in common with each other than they do with the more progressive arms of their own religion. And again, that comes down to worldview perspectives and levels of development, and religion sort of is an epiphenomena of consciousness levels. But it's also interesting because when you look at the field that we're interested in the UFO phenomenon, and and paranormality, how do these different aspects of our personhood impact that? Like, for instance, one thing I've noticed in looking at my stats, right, for my podcast, and this is true for pretty much all of the podcasts. Thankfully, we have some women holding down the fort that have their own shows and are on shows and whatnot. But generally, this is a male-dominant field, right, of interest, and that's interesting in itself, right? To pay attention to that, and therefore, how much is the conversation skewed, or how much of the conversation is missing? Half of the the universe in terms of reflection, because we don't have enough women giving their perspective on what's going on, and even things like, when I think about ethnicity, you think about, in some ways, the others that are encountered, the descriptions are quite white centric, the kind of like Aryan looking Nordic types. Some have even suggested there's a kind of subtle racism there. Like, what is going on there? Why is that the case? Or is it a case of us seeing what we want to see? Is there something more to that? What could be the reason behind that? And then also many people will also point out that this field is American centric, right? That there are some people that even go so far as to say, why do all the UFO sightings and all the abductions happen in America, not elsewhere? We know it's not that simple, but I see their point that maybe the way that we have a frame around us that we're born into makes us look at these things a certain way. All of these things are really fascinating to think about. Even something as like arbitrary as birth order, right? You and I have talked about this with our kids, each of us having siblings as well. And it's amazing how consistently that does play a role in personality development, and that is the most arbitrary of things, what birth order you came in. And yet it really does seem to have across the board impact on who you become and your personality. So it is fascinating. And I think one of the reasons why I think it's a good idea to get into this was your idea, but I think it's a great idea, is because these different elements are not often brought to bear when it comes to thinking about the UFO phenomenon.
Right. And we so easily, I think, arrive on the scene and just sort of think that the way a situation is being described, or the way a story is told, that's just sort of on face the way that it actually is. And we forget the fact that it's being mediated to us through a person with experience and background and history, and how they are telling us this experience and relaying it to us is not free of that baggage that they bring. And one thing I want to touch on too, because while I really think it's valuable for us to be able to see these various factors that influence our perspective, and I think it's important to try to be, as best we can, be objective about them and even challenge them where we can. I would also say that there is a value in finding some level of peace with the things that you cannot control. So we can, in many ways, look at these factors and fight against them our entire lives, and really struggle with coming to any kind of meaningful sort of peace. And I think there is a point at which we have to say, whether I like it or not, this is a part of me, and it's a part of me that I have to be honest with. And even if that honesty sometimes might mean I'm biased towards it, but I think being able to at least recognize that on some level is going to be a healthy way to approach these factors. I also don't think it's good for us to necessarily, although I think it's easy for us to do this now, I don't think it's necessarily good for us to go around trying to militantly identify the baggage or the various lenses of those around us and call them to task on those things. I think it's important that we really try to describe and educate and explain how these factors do shape our experience. But it's not up to us necessarily to go after everyone and everyone's perspective and say, well, you think that because you have XYZ issues. Those issues can be present, but I think there is a better way for us to engage in a conversation than to start there, if you will.
I agree. And I think we both kind of hinted at this, and it's worth pointing out. And that is, because I have two thoughts. The first thought is, as we both kind of hinted at already, the conventional thinking is that all of these are arbitrary, right? Where you're born, who you're born to, when you're born, all those circumstances we see. The conventional understanding is that is something you have no say in. Of course, we should acknowledge, especially in this field, that there are a lot of experiencers who have, and not just experiencers in the UFO phenomenon, but even people who have had near-death experiences and people who remember past lives, who suggested we do actually play a role, even if we've forgotten, in what kind of iteration, the details of the iteration we show up in, because ultimately the goal is the growth of our souls, not comfort, basically. Now, I understand some people are wary of that because it can seem dismissive of people who are in very difficult circumstances. And again, you can almost end up in a kind of caste system kind of thinking. I think what we try to do on this show, we do this as individuals, and I think we're trying to promote this in our show, is sort of a balanced perspective, whether it's not always either or, it's both and. These are complex issues. We don't want to be dismissive of people who have difficult circumstances and say, well, you signed up for it, so you must have a good reason, even if you're not aware of it. That's not hugely helpful. At the same time, I think we do have to be aware that the conventional thinking that it's completely arbitrary might also not be the full picture. And experiencer narratives certainly seem to suggest that's the case. And the last thing I would add, and you touched on it already, that sometimes the people who are the most triumphant, the best examples of humanity, are the people who've come from the most difficult circumstances. So sometimes that kind of, fire can give birth to a phoenix that becomes, paramount player in moving human consciousness forward. So again, while we do want to be sympathetic, empathetic, help people who have difficult circumstances, we also need to remember ultimately that sometimes people in difficult circumstances become, amazing examples of what humanity can become. And so it's not, again, it's not a simple answer. We want to be aware of these issues, but also not reduce people to just these issues.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, whether we sort of align with the perspective that we chose this kind of life, before we were born, or not, I think that to me at least, it's not as important if you believe that. I think what is important is to when you look at it from this perspective that there are so many things that shape who we are that we had no real choosing in per se, at least in the way in which we think about them in our present moment. Since even if you buy into the narrative that we chose it before now, many of us have amnesia or whatever that was, right? So there are many things that make me that I in a very real sense did not select. But when you understand that about yourself, then you can easily relay that to everyone else in your experience, in your lived experience, and your relational experience. And understanding that leads to so much charity, you know, for us to not go after someone who disagrees with us, and engage in a kind of vitriolic warfare with them. When we look at this from the perspective of, all of the things that shape who we are, so many of them we didn't choose, then it makes us way more charitable to those around us. And I think gives us a greater sense of wisdom and grace when it comes to the different perspectives that we're going to encounter in our life. And let's not forget that difference of perspective enriches our own perspective, enriches our own experience, even those perspectives that may be at odds with the things that we hold dear.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when we go to war with people, like you were hinting at there, when it becomes vitriolic, often what we're fighting is our own subconscious.
Mm.
Because we may be projecting and rejecting and shaming something that we used to be. I've seen people who've come out of cultic backgrounds or come out of religious fundamentalism be the most, triumphant warriors against that kind of thinking, right? But in many ways, what I think they're doing is a kind of penance for what they used to be,
Mm.
And when I think the better response is charity, like you said, and hopefully some understanding that says, if I was there at one point, surely I should have some charity for the person who's there now. Because again, a lot of that just happens to be where they grew up, who they happen to listen to, what books they stumbled across. When people are, thrown into the world, into incarnation, and suddenly become adults, pretty quickly, and then trying to just make sense of life and get through it. And for so many people, that's difficult alone. To try and form some overarching narrative about what it all means, even when that's changing generation to generation, people tend to grab for whatever happens to be right in front of them,
Mm.
and we all do that. And that's why, how can we not have a charitable attitude towards someone across the other side of the world who maybe sees us as the enemy, but they only see us as the enemy based on where they were born, and we do the same towards them, and sometimes when it comes to like different fundamentalisms, we are kind of naive and hypocritical about favoring one kind of fundamentalism over another, rather than recognizing they're two iterations of the same basic mindset or basic developmental level. So yeah, these are all things to keep in mind when we move forward.
Right, and to apply it to our interest, to the interest in UFOs and the phenomenon and paranormality. We are dealing with this otherness, and otherness, seems exotic when we talk about it in the context of UFOs and the phenomenon, but otherness is around us all the time. If you're in a relationship with anyone, you're in a relationship with another, not of yourself. And so these are tools. This is an awareness that impacts the way in which you understand your life and the life that will come at you from areas expected and unexpected. And so I think too with the phenomenon, we are bringing our whole selves to this task of understanding. And as much as we, I think, like to lionize our science and kind of say science leads the way, and it's very clean and clear headed and rational, highly rational. Science is made of people. It's an obvious thing to say, but every scientist brings to their science these aspects of themselves. And so, this is an important subject to touch on, even though I think at first glance, it may seem as if it's not a helpful way to approach the phenomenon. But when you really step back and look at it, it's fundamental to our understanding of what this is.
Yeah, and I would add that I've mentioned several times now, noticing this historical trend towards pendulum swinging. In many ways, the scientific revolution became about, at first, surviving the church, right? Try not to get burned at the stake by, getting accused of, questioning the church on anything. How dare you question, the astronomical order? You might get burned at the stake. To suddenly being handed the new reins of the priesthood, so to speak, when science sort of took over because of technological success. And then it became its role to stamp out the church, right? There have been many leaders, directors of various scientific institutes and whatnot in psychology and in the natural sciences, in physics, who basically like publicly said their goal is to stamp out religion, right? Because they see that as the enemy now. When again, that's in that case, it's not subconscious projection, it's collective unconscious projection, that we are basically judging and condemning who we used to be. And again, thinking the new thing is shiny and new, and we should grab onto that, and it has nothing wrong with it. The other aspect I want to add too, when it comes to the circumstances we're born into, in many ways, I think the reason why UFOs became a big thing in the 20th century was because they were allowed, right? Because in Western civilization, where technology is the shiny object everyone wants, and we see that as the promise of our future, when these technological objects manifest in the sky, a Western civilization can say, yes, this looks exciting. What's this about? Whereas now, with all the woo, with all the high strangeness, we recognize that indigenous cultures in Australia might have been dealing with these same beings, but in a very different way, and they wouldn't consider it technology really, or shamanic cultures, right? Same thing, dealing with non-human intelligence for eons, but framing it very differently. So it's not even that, as I said earlier, all the UFO sightings happen to be in North America or whatever. It can also be that our expectations, the way we frame things, what we get excited about, what we think is even possible, shapes both what we see and how we interpret what we see. So again, when we've got the fact that our consciousness seems to play a role in how this manifests in some way, then that might even more be the case. But all of these factors are important to think about, especially when we're talking about paranormality, high strangeness, and UFOs.
Mm-hmm. Right, very much so. What do we make room for, right? What do we exclude and then allow in our sort of perceptual awareness? And I think, so as we've talked about kind of the individual factors that kind of shape who we are directly or indirectly, we also, of course, have very strong cultural factors that shape who we are. And we are all people of culture. Even if you lived with a kind of very isolated situation in just a small farmhouse or something, you're going to live in a culture of a family, presumably. But I think anybody or most everyone in the world today is embedded in a culture, and those cultures serve us and define and shape the way in which we understand reality around us. What is normative in experience? What is non-normative? All of that is determined in many ways by our cultural milieu. In the past, humans have been well served, at least functionally, by kind of very elaborate mythologies that we look back on. They're very much sort of highly anthropomorphized, and many have this imaginative, broad spectrum of this pantheon of gods and goddesses, kind of that are involved and engaged in our lives, either directly or maybe dispassionately, and we're just kind of like dealing with whatever antics they're up to. But these stories in the past in our human history really helped to shape the ways in which our ancestors navigated the world and navigated the seasons and navigated relationships and birth and death. All of these things were impacted by the stories, and also the stories of the stars, which took such a huge role in the minds of our ancestors, gazing up at that canopy and knowing that cycle every day and every year was correlated with certain activity. And so for so long, those narratives served us extremely well. And I think, we in our current day and age, we tend to look back at that and think, oh, that's, so barbaric, or how naive. But we forget that the explanatory power of those narratives and the way in which it captured imaginations, and just the inertia of that kind of cultural mix that people were born into, it's really hard to shake. And just looking back on it and seeing those kinds of empires and mythologies and narratives rise and fall, again, we have a position now where we think, well, we've kind of emerged from that, and we're not going to go through that again. But the reality is we have our own mythologies now. We have our own new narratives that surround us and our culture, and tell us directly and indirectly what things are part of normal experience and what things are not. And of course, science has come into the picture now as well. But how do you think about the ways in which our narrative frameworks have changed from that cultural perspective?
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I would say that it's not even necessarily a straight line. So we know it's not a linear process. So it's not so much that we've left the past and we're moving in a straight line away from it, but more like a spiral kind of process where we tend to come back around. And part of the role of the collective unconscious is that it sort of, the shadow that rises up in us as a collective makes us aware, even if it's kind of in symbolic language, which we eventually incorporate into our worldview, these aspects that we've left behind that we need to bring back in. But hopefully we bring it back in a more sophisticated way. We re-include what we've objected to before. So we're both, as I've said many times, transcending and including, ideally, is what we should do. That's the healthy process. And when we don't do that, I think the collective unconscious, the spirit of the collective unconscious, puts up a stink, so to speak, and makes us aware of that. I think that, again, because people have difficult lives in many ways, and life seems so short for many people, it's not like you and I, like you pointed out, we, compared to the rest of most people in the world, we're incredibly well off, right? We have so much privilege because of our gender. We're both Caucasian. We, both live in America, upper middle class. So all these things play in our favor. And it means that we can sit around and host a podcast like this. Many people just in parts of the world just don't have this opportunity for many, many reasons. The technology, the time, the resources, the educational background, all of that we can count ourselves lucky to and privileged to have part of our background. Because we're trying to make our way through lives as individuals, we just sort of ascribe to others, to authority, and say, tell me what is reality, tell me what is in that frame of the possible, right? And we inherit that through our educational system and whatnot. So again, what's interesting here is that even though it shifts over time, the individual often doesn't have much say in that, because they are basically a product of their cultural framework. And what's interesting with the UFO phenomenon is sometimes it's people who have these really anomalous experiences who have no choice but to question the conventional narrative about what's possible because they've experienced it directly. And if you spend any time in this field, what's interesting is if you haven't yourself had that experience, you very quickly meet people who have. And then we become a very unique subset of the society at large who are aware of these data sets that don't play well with the conventional narrative. And that's what it means to be part of this community.
Mm-hmm. You made me think of something that, I mean, when I'd say it, it's so obvious, but I don't think about it very often. But when we look back at the past and look at the lives of those who've gone before us, we have no access or very little access, very limited access to the inner lives of those people. And we really are looking at societal shifts and change. And so, you bring up a good point with the very sort of radical nature of phenomenal experience and how it impacts individuals. Uh, and when when those stories are shared with us, they we have this amazing ability to sort of internalize and adopt language into our own inner life. So even though I may not have had the experience you have had, by you telling me your experience, I can live it in a way. It's an approximate way, but that entire process is in many ways kind of invisible from the standpoint of history. That when you take a broad sweeping view of what has gone before us, these experiences at the individual level are happening all the time and throughout our history, throughout our societies and civilizations, but they emerge as societal change in retrospective, evaluation. And so, it's just an interesting, for me at least, a way to think about what's happening now with the UFO phenomenon and how we may perceive it in the future, looking back to now, and not necessarily seeing the inner lives and inner experiences of those that have really had that firsthand moment with it, but seeing it more so as that societal shift and change.
Yeah, and on top of that, if you think about it, that expression that says, history is written by the victors.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in the same way, all of the rough spots, the ups and downs, the complexity gets smoothed out, right? So when we read about, and that's why people can even have a romantic notion about the past, right? And they say, wish we lived like it was like everybody lived on farms and rode horses into town. And so we have this kind of romantic notion about the way it used to be, not aware of all the hardships and the difficulty and the many ways that our lives are so much simpler. Even though I understand that to some degree we've created our own complexity and challenges because of the ease of our lives in some ways. But yeah, it is interesting that when you read history, what you tend to get is kind of the glossed over, truncated, smoothed out version of the history. When in any era you happen to live in, you recognize it's really complex. There's a lot of gray and there's a lot of confusion in the midst of it, and competing worldviews that are sort of battling it out to make the best sense of the data. And again, what's interesting for those of us really invested in this topic is that we are daily, dealing with data sets that 99% of the population is not even aware of, and that just puts us in an interesting place, and yet that will probably be smoothed out in history eventually. So once a new overarching narrative does emerge that makes sense of this phenomenon, at least better than we can now, all of the ups and downs and the complexity that we live day to day will probably be lost to history.
Mm-hmm. Well, and everything that we've kind of touched on thus far in this episode have revolved around kind of the elephant in the room, and that is the scientific method and the way that science has impacted our understanding of the world in which we live. I mean, for us to be even able to articulate these different aspects of what make up our personalities and perspectives, it required first the sort of shifting of viewpoint, as you said earlier, from this ordained existence that we were just happened to find ourselves in, and this is just the way things are, to an existence that does incorporate this analytical, sort of piecemeal reductionistic way of subdividing the world. And these then themselves are incredibly valuable and meaningful tools in the study of the phenomenon. So we have our academic institutions, which in many ways we champion and are the pinnacle of what we have achieved through Enlightenment science. This sort of very staid academia now. Even though now, I guess too, we could say, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about it, the way in which that momentum is itself kind of arresting in a way that it hadn't before in the decades that preceded us in the 20th century. We are arriving at a place where the things that we have taken for granted in academia as being trusted and valuable are themselves starting to erode. Before we get there, though, how is it that you view our relationship to science and its place in our lives now versus kind of where we were before, which was much more sort of centered on religious paradigms, or sort of that king or queen sort of situation of existence in different countries. And we've kind of moved away from that now to these different democracies, and all of these are kind of emerging properties of science.
Yeah, I think the key in this is to do the scientific revolution justice, but also be willing to critique some of the consequences of it as well. But I think one thing I would point out is that our desire and our tendency towards narrative shaping processes doesn't stop, no matter what new way of making sense of the world we adopt. So when the church ruled the day, or maybe even in Eastern spirituality, you may have, like you said, this sort of pantheon of gradations of gods, and this is the god over the sea, but he's also subject to this, and blah blah blah. And it's like this really long list. It almost seems scientific in some ways, the way it's broken down, almost like a chemical chart. And yet what we've done now with reductionistic materialism is said that all that really is matter, the physical world. And we think by breaking things down into smaller and smaller and smaller parts, that eventually we'll have said everything there is to say about reality. But we're never content to say what's really going on. And what's really going on with science is we are describing the behavior of nature, and our technological success that has arisen out of the scientific method is so impressive, right? We live long lives now, generally much healthier than we used to be. We, you and I, part of the reason why we're both well read is because we grew up in an era where the internet existed, so we can search a body of data that even the Library of Alexandria couldn't boast, right? And yet what science really has gotten good about is, again, modeling the way nature behaves, what nature will do. And because of that, we have predictive power, which allows us to develop technologies where we can harness the power of nature for our own benefit. But the irony is we don't stop there, though. Even though that's where all the success has been, we still try to create metaphysical models around that. We try to we just by our nature make assumptions based on what we're seeing in the behavior about the ultimate nature, even though that's not really what science is designed to do by definition. All it can do is make predictions about the way nature will behave. It can't ultimately say what nature is. And yet we still do it. That's the point I'm trying to make here, is that, humans are going to human. That's what we tend to do. When it was the church and, Christianity ruling much of Western civilization, that became our meaning-making model. And now with science, we've kind of adopted this scientific reductionistic perspective, and that rules the day. And as you pointed at there, slowly but surely there is data coming from that very field that is undermining the metaphysical assumptions that we have drawn up around it, which is an interesting process. But again, because people do not like being in a vacuum of meaning, right? People want to have meaning-making models to get themselves up in the morning, the scientific community has been very slow to acknowledge the way it's bleeding at the margins, so to speak, because of some of the experiments that have been done, evidence that's coming out of quantum mechanics, that's coming out of neuroscience. The hard problem of consciousness is staring science in the face, and it's not just a problem, it's a logical inconsistency within the paradigm. And yet people are very slow to acknowledge that, because we don't want to, if we acknowledge that, then we have to also acknowledge that we're in a period, an era, entering an era where we have no overarching meaning-making model at all. And nothing scares people more than that. That's what our history tells us.
How do you think that the sort of scientific disciplines are going to wrestle with non-human intelligence? And in some ways, I think there's an underlying assumption that the world itself has an intelligence, like just as you said, that we're able to take these tools of scientific discovery and we can map onto the world behavior. So we're ascribing behavior to the world, but in a way that does, in some ways, imply a type of intelligence that is not a human intelligence. So I guess what I'm getting at here is we have been going through this exercise of postulating non-human intelligence for a very long time. We can point to it, with our religious traditions, plenty of fuel there for that concept, and then in our science as well. It's just become much more kind of amorphous. Like it's not anthropomorphized as a bearded person in the sky, but it is the world in which we find ourselves, behaves in a certain way and can be understood and can be mapped, and we can bring tools to bear to essentially kind of master it, or at least coexist with it in a way that benefits us, and enhances our life rather than diminishes that. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on a couple of things. Sort of one, the exercise of science in how it approaches this concept of non-human intelligence, just generally. But do you think that we currently are, or at least in the process of taking a lot of those disciplines and starting to wrestle with aspects of the phenomenon that we hear about? Because I would hope that we are doing that, or trying to do that, because we talk a lot about government disclosure and kind of what they know, what they're going to tell us. And we talk about the Galileo project in the community and what it's going to discover. But you and I both know that whatever revelation does emerge will have to, all of our disciplines that have become these pillars of our society are going to wrestle with this new reality and are going to have to incorporate facets of this reality into their disciplines. Do you think we're doing this in any meaningful way now? And if we're not, what are some ways we could be doing it as we move forward?
Well, if I'm honest, I'd say that we're doing it in a kicking and screaming kind of way, which again has always been the case with our civilization. When you think back again, like I mentioned a couple times ago, Thomas Kuhn's discussion of scientific revolutions, how science actually progresses, that as much as science, like you pointed out, ultimately the way it's practiced, unfortunately, there's no way to do it without human beings being involved generally. And this is ironic too, because even when it comes to AI, part of the challenge is we program the AI, right? So we build in all of our biases into the data structures themselves. But yeah, I think that when you look back, even sort of the Middle Ages and the church's ruling, the tendency tends to be, again, we like to believe we know what's going on, generally speaking, and we leave a little bit of margin, like 5, 10%, even 10% is more than we're comfortable with, in terms of saying we don't really know what's going on, so this is going to be the cherry on top, right? And yet, what I think most confounds us and challenges us has to do with our place on the food chain, so to speak. If it's true, not only that intelligence exists outside of humanity, but perhaps has always been here in our midst and is so far beyond us or so other to us that we haven't even had the capacity to recognize it. That's a whole different level, right? Like you could argue that an ant colony, unless you come and stamp on it, it's largely unaware of you. If you're driving by in your car, your existence has no impact directly, and so it may have no knowledge of you. We don't like to put ourselves in the position relatively of the ants, right? But that may very well be accurate. So, when science, does try to reach out, when NASA tries to reach out, when we try to SETI and projects like that, again, it tends to be, listen, we have certain understandings or assumptions about the way the world should work, including the universe. And so we're going to look for it in a certain way to find that cherry on top, right? We First of all, it's just very difficult to do it any other way, because how can you move forward without some operating assumptions, right? That's how we make our way through the world. And yet, what I think is challenging with the UFO phenomenon data and the literature is that there is mounting evidence that the way we see the world is quite a ways off. It's not just missing that 5 or 10% margin. When you think about even notions like dark energy and dark matter, we posit those, right, to try and fulfill our understanding of the nature of the cosmos, and then sort of mutter under our breath, and that's the vast, vast majority, is this stuff we call dark energy and dark matter. It's the vast majority of the stuff out there. It must be, because our model of the universe wouldn't hold together otherwise. And yet we also mutter under our breath that we admit that we don't really know what it is, right? So it's like postulating a hypothesis where the vast majority of it you don't actually understand, but you just sort of, it's like a God of the gaps kind of thinking. If we posit this, then the whole thing holds together. But the society around you that has given you these reins as the new priesthood believes you really know what's going on. And actually, you're kind of admitting you don't. And people who pay close attention recognize that that's what we're really saying. This, as much as I'd like to say there's an embrace of this, and we will open the reins to try and really look at this squarely, that doesn't tend to be how we do things. And I don't think that's going to change. There are all sorts of power structures in government, in science, in academia that, we've talked about this many times, the John Macks of the world, there's a reason why Jacques Vallée is part of the invisible college, right? Because these people have, for a long period of time, couldn't do it visibly because it would mean the end of their careers, the end of their academic opportunity. And these are people who have to raise families and pay bills like everybody else. And as much as that sounds so unscientific, that by just daring to ask certain questions, you could lose your livelihood as a member of academia who's supposed to be in the process, in the business of asking questions and exploring reality. The reality is, socially, within our construct, is that you can only ask certain questions within certain bounds, and that be okay. So what will be interesting to see, and it will be a messy process, is when the data itself forces open those boundaries and says, we will not play nice with your assumptions about reality. Those of us who've paid attention to the data see that already. It's going to be a rude awakening for most of the academic infrastructure to see that themselves.
Mm-hmm. And we see this take place in the community, the UFO community. This kind of instinctive, reflexive reaction against the woo, as we talk about that, because in many ways we don't have a means to evaluate it. But I'm thinking about the sort of the OSAP stuff and the commissioning of the Deard reports, and really asking academics who are very good in their disciplines to really expand and think theoretically about areas of science that we have no mastery of now, but what might they look like? And I'm wondering, if we do need to sort of capture some of this in our academic institutions and enshrine it in just more generally, because it seems to me, and I'm certainly not a scientist, so I could be very wrong, but we are really only pursuing things that are generally kind of agreed as worthy of pursuit. So you can't be a person who might be a biologist who has a fanciful idea about a new biome, because that sounds so outside the norm of consensus biology that you're not going to get any funding. You're not going to. So I'm wondering, how do we create sort of new disciplines, or room within the disciplines that we have, that allow for broad theoretical thinking? Because it seems to me that that's how we can sort of find a new way to better understand this and what's happening. We have to be bold to ask these questions, even if they end up taking us down blind alleys. But I don't feel like we're doing a good job of asking bold questions anymore at all. And I hear Avi Loeb saying that as well as others.
Yeah, like to use your analogy there, say if you want to do research into the possibility of an extra frequential biome, right? A biome that exists that is just beyond our normal bounds of perception. And yeah, unless you can show convincing data that that is the best answer for some of what we see going on, you're going to have a very hard time moving forward. Why? Because these things take a lot of money. Like you look at someone like Dean Radin, and part of the reason he goes on so many podcasts is because he constantly has to raise money for their next experiment. It's not like money grows on trees for scientists either, right? Like they have to. I mean, beyond the Robert Bigelows of the world, there's only so many of them, willing to fund these things out of the billions of their real estate empire. Most of the time, these scientists on the fringe have no choice but to try to raise awareness and string together enough money for their next experiment. And they don't even bother thinking about the second or third experiment down the road, because that'll be its own fundraising campaign, right? So they have to sort of string together one experiment to the next. And, if you're within academic structures, then you better at least have tenure before you try in some of this, because if you do get too outside the mainstream, too unorthodox, again, this sounds a lot like religion when you really think about it, you just won't get tenure, right? You'll be politely escorted out of the building. And that's what Harvard tried to do with John Mack in many ways. So I wish there was a way that I saw evidence that we're really moving forward. I don't think, again, I think it's going to be in a manner of kicking and screaming, that it's only when the data will not fit. There are always, thankfully, the Jacques Valleys of the world that are willing to go where the data leads. I mean, that's what the spirit of science says you should do, that if the data is telling you that your hypothesis can't possibly be correct because there's too much outlier data and it happens too regularly, then science should welcome that, because that's the business it's in. Unfortunately, the practice often doesn't live up to the spirit, and scientism takes over, where there's all sorts of assumptions about what's even possible and certainly what you can get funded to study. So again, there are signs that it's beginning to change. Slowly but surely. I think Diana Pasulka has pointed out that fewer people have to be in invisible colleges than used to be the case. They can. There are actually people who actually can be in academia and study some of this. Michael Masters put forward the time travel hypothesis, and because it's based on sound scientific principles, he's been welcomed in his university and encouraged to keep going. But again, it's a tricky process, and I feel for people in those structures. I've had academics write me who like my podcast, want to study this, and they ask me what kind of positions I think exist in academia that they could pursue to be able to do it. And I'm not in a position to answer because I'm not in academia. But I feel for them, because I recognize what they're saying is, if I come out and am honest about what I want to study and what I think might be going on, or what avenues I'm even interested in pursuing, I might lose my job. So again, the good news is it's slowly changing, but the truth is it's definitely slow.
it's funny because you can point to a lot of sort of events that happen that bring together professionals from different disciplines, and they're incredibly energizing. I mean, I'm thinking of what the event that happened last year at the National Cathedral, where we had sort of people from the government, we had theologians, we had scientists, all on this stage in this grand space, really talking about the future of humanity in space, our relationship with that. And I got the impression, I certainly wasn't there, but it was very energizing to see those different individuals interact and come at this topic from different perspectives. And I just, it's a shame in a way how our academic disciplines have become so narrowly focused and isolated. I also wonder to what degree, as our technology improves, our ability to kind of tease out connections across disciplines through artificial intelligence, if that may reveal to us some connections that aren't visible to those who are in their in their respective schools of thought, but there may be a tool that kind of runs in the background that sort of pops up and says, hey, you're working on this particular avenue of study. You may not be aware, but so and so who's over here in this discipline, there's an intersection happening that neither of you have an awareness of, and you should have a conversation. So what I find funny about just all of that generally is that our science, we've gotten really good about making science, like taking the human beings out of science, and we forget that either that we are still human, that we need relationship, and it is in those relationships that a lot of meaning takes place. And so, how do we invigorate and infuse our science with opportunities for us to kind of not only share our experiences, but champion the things that make us human and that give meaning to our lives, and not just kind of box them into this place that says, well, that's, that's not how I would explain it scientifically. That's just a story. So I'm going to put it over here in this kind of neat, I don't have to worry about it too much. It's not science. I can ignore it for now. How do we kind of bring this back together in a way? And you've talked about this before, kind of the spiraling nature of it, kind of pull some things from our past that were more relational, were more sort of place higher value on individual experience, but bring in the great qualities of science that have allowed us to achieve so much.
Well, I think one of the things that needs to change, and again, people like Jacques Vallée have talked about this. John Alexander has also talked about this. He's talked about the phenomenon is easily as complicated as cancer, and we, put enormous wealth towards cancer every year, and brilliant minds around the world trying to figure that out. Right. A big problem with science in academia is we've focused on specialization. Right. So, what's astounding about the data coming out of the UFO phenomenon is that it crosses across many fields. It refuses to be boxed by our usual assumptions, right? So we should have physicists and astronomers and geneticists, all involved, psychologists, psychiatrists, archaeologists. It goes across the board, right? Like, all of those need to be involved because it refuses to play by our rules again. And yet the way that academic structures are set up, you get your education and then you choose a specialty. And it's kind of really frowned upon if you're daring to say something about a field that's not your specialization. So there's sort of like this, neighborhood mentality of like, stay on your side of the border kind of thing. And yet in that, while it's allowed for some great advances, it also has frustrated our efforts to make generalized progress, I think. And in a topic such as this, which again is so complex, there's so many issues to it. When you think about all the theories, all the hypotheses out there, they run the gamut in terms of what are the factors that give impetus to the origin of the UFO phenomenon, that it needs to be an interdisciplinary study. It absolutely does. And yet, again, that's one of the challenges with our current structures, is that knowledge is not understood to be gained that way. Rather, we focus on these fields of specialization because this is so all-encompassing, because this is saying something about reality itself. I think we have no choice to make it, but to make it a multidisciplinary kind of endeavor. But again, we're fighting an uphill battle to make that happen. And the people who do tend to do it are the brave souls who say, I don't care what the norm is. I know that this is how I have to approach this, because this is what the data, again, is telling me. And I'll go where the data leads. And again, I think back to that paper that Valet did, the 6-layer model. That was basically his plea, was saying science has to get involved, and it has to be a multidisciplinary kind of approach. That's the only way we'll make headway. Otherwise, we're going to keep hitting these brick walls. As much as there's been amazing progress on one hand, I think I also mentioned to you recently that I saw an interview from the early 1990s, I think 1991, where I realized this one person was saying some really cutting edge things about what the nature of the phenomenon might ultimately be, and it has to do with reality itself. And that sounded cutting edge then. And the irony is there are new people saying the exact same things that sound cutting edge today. And that's because these things never really take on a life of their own, because they hit these walls that exist within our structures to prevent further discourse, further investigation. So I'm glad it's changing. It needs to keep changing, and it needs to broaden in order for us to really, I think, grapple with all of the elements of what's going on.
How would you counsel someone who is listening to this and thinking through the various avenues of approaching the topic, and how do you not kind of arrive at a place that it feels a little bit as if the ground is not solid? How do you apply a certain set of tools, or go through the catalog of tools that you have at your disposal, and in that process sort of gain clarity, or sort of winnow them down to saying, okay, this one seems like the best way to explain what we are seeing and hearing. And even then, I wonder, particularly with respect to experiences, the individual experiences that we hear about, the tools of evaluation for those sort of stories, the kind of normal scientific analysis is a little bit difficult or fleeting. It becomes much more psychological, a study of consciousness and how it works. How are we to really even put together the right toolkit here to say, hey, we're making progress? How will we even know we're making progress, in other words, in this discipline?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that part of the irony when I think about it is that what science is supposed to be good about doing, and the reason why we have been so successful in terms of developing technology around science as the fruit of science, is that we've been able to isolate factors and variables and say that when we control for these variables, this is what happens. Therefore, we can make this prediction about nature. And because we've been very diligent and objective about that, we make accurate predictions. And that allows us to create technology which harnesses the power of nature, which has transformed our civilization, right? And yet something as simple as, if you're dealing with an intelligence, a non-human intelligence, potentially one that's even more sophisticated than you, your variables are going to change, right? And so when you think about OSAP, you think about the investigations they did at Skinwalker Ranch and other places that are mentioned in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. They tried to get video footage, right? They tried to get photographic footage. They tried various sensor data, and some sort of force interfered with the sensors, right? Would shut off the camera right when something was going to manifest. And again, I mentioned this several times now, but John Alexander coined this term precognitive sentient phenomena. And what he meant by that was they know what we're going to do before we do it. And so, of course, that's going to throw a wrench in your plans to try and study this scientifically because, again, we assume that if we control for variables, they will behave, right? But by the very nature of this phenomenon, by the very nature of this being an intelligence involved, we cannot make those assumptions. And we see all sorts of evidence that they do change things. And on top of that, they seem to be able to experience reality in a nonlinear way in terms of time, space time. So, what that should do is make us go back to the drawing board and say, wait a second, we've got a whole new data set here saying that an experience of nonlinear time exists, right? By the way, this has also come out of the parapsychological research too, although the scientific community largely ignores that as well. Those should be opportunities to open the aperture, so to speak, and say, how do we ask new questions? How do we design new experiments where maybe the first thing we do is we try and find evidence of manipulation of space-time. And then from there, we develop a further theory or a further hypothesis that we test. But if we rigidly stick to our pre-existing notions about how variables will behave, then this phenomenon has shown time and time again it will not play well with that, and we won't make progress. So again, it's really about the people that are willing to come along and be trailblazers, and they have to fight that really tricky battle of getting enough funding, enough interest, not be too crazy in the mainstream's eyes to keep moving forward. And I see there's a certain small number, you can count them sort of almost one hand, maybe two, of those scientists who are still very much in the mainstream. They're respected and they're trying to produce evidence, Gary Nolan, Jacques Vallée, people like that, and get it peer reviewed as well. Because when you get it peer reviewed, now you've got people acknowledging that this is not just your fanciful thinking, this is not your bias, this is evidenced from multiple experiments. So again, happening slowly but surely, and all we can hope is that there'll be more and more people willing to take up that process.
And do you think that ultimately we will need, at some point, we will hit a wall? We will need the assistance or the cooperation of the other intelligence itself. That I would think that there's only so much we can learn through the effects of whatever it is about its nature, its intentions, its thinking. To the extent that we can even understand its way of thinking, we would at least need some level of engagement to try to do that kind of translation effort to help us better understand. But I also, I guess, think too in that process, this is the sort of power of ideas themselves, that it doesn't necessarily take a postulation that there's a non-human intelligence to drive our science, drive our understanding, drive our thinking that there is another intelligence vaster than our own. I mean, any kind of state, for example, that is trying to outwit their adversaries is going to assume their adversaries have some sort of level of gamesmanship or technology that their own technology or way of thinking can't predict for. So you sub in an imaginative way, not having access to what they really know, an adversary, and I'm using that word just for the purpose of this, discussion,
right?
That helps push and drive the discovery and the methodologies and the science that you develop. So it's interesting how we have this unique capability, in other words, to advance our understanding against what could very well be nothing. It could be purely imaginative, but it still pushes us forward. And it says something about the nature of, I guess, really are the qualities of what we are, but also perhaps even to some degree the universe, I think, and it's because we are part of it, driving us toward this sense of grander awareness in this relationship that is not really ever fully known. And I suppose that that's true for any relationship. You know, relationship with a partner or whatever. You know them, but you know their external life, and the longer you know them, you start to sort of understand their internal life, but you never know them. So what who you relate to is something that you have created. You know, so this is always a facet of our relationship with any other. And so I do wonder, as this moves forward and as we hopefully start to get, you know, more facts and data on what's really going on, you know, to what degree are we changed by those revelations, but then how do we also, or when do we then bring in other elements that are that arise out of our imaginations in response to those new revelations that may or may not even be real.
Yeah, it's interesting when you brought up how we sometimes pursue knowledge or endeavors based on what we perceive our adversaries may be doing, and to some extent, we are sort of trying to develop those assumptions based on silence sometimes, but it's educated silence. And so I was thinking about how, for instance, the remote viewing program in the 70s at SRI, we've talked about several times in this podcast. What some people might not be aware of is that the reason why the US government intelligence community decided they were willing to explore this is because they gained intelligence suggesting the Soviets were already doing it, right? And so, even though there was all sorts of religious opposition to this kind of way of gaining intelligence that some people just saw as nefarious and dark and spiritual ultimately, and you shouldn't mess with it, in the midst of a Cold War, if you're concerned that your adversary is going to develop a methodology, a technology, even if it's an inner science kind of thing that they can use against you, then by necessity, you have no choice but to do that. So that's interesting, first of all. Another point you raised that I think is really interesting, and it's the X factor in all of this, is what role the phenomenon plays in the future in terms of how we embrace this topic. I think one thing I think a lot about, and I think I've mentioned it on here, is how there's this increasingly brazen behavior by one aspect of the phenomenon anyway in engaging with our military. So, our naval ships and whatnot out in the oceans are again encountering these things regularly. And while some politicians and some in the public still debate is this like Chinese or Russian drones, anybody who really has looked at this uh, says over and over again, this is beyond next level technology. This is something that no human civilization, unless it's some sort of rogue civilization that exists that we haven't been aware of, this is not a normal nation state player that we're aware of. It's just no one has that kind of technology. Um, and so the fact that they've been so brazen, and it seems to be increasing, both the number of sightings and again the nature of the sightings seems to be much more like in your face kind of thing. And so you wonder, what is that about? That's a really fascinating question for me. Is that in the same way that we developed a remote viewing program out of necessity because we were concerned the Soviets were doing so, if this force, whatever it is, this element of the phenomenon that is engaging with our military keeps doing so, and keeps increasing the way it's doing so, again, by necessity, we will have no choice but to ramp up our efforts to understand what it is, right? And that may be the X factor in all of this. They may be, pushing the envelope as a way to get us to engage. It's hard to see it in any other way unless you can sort of frame it as we are somehow, again, engaging in some sort of behavior that they're now seeing as a threat, and that's why they're engaging with us. That's possible, but I don't know. It's interesting, and when you think about Jacques Vallée and his control system hypothesis, that's sort of a really overarching view, right? It's saying that there are forces, boundaries, response systems that are slowly but surely managing our evolution, and that we may never see it firsthand. We only see the effects of it, kind of like the wind, right? You see the flag moving, so you know there's wind. That may be what's going on with some elements of the phenomenon. And again, part of the challenge here is that people want to reduce it to one thing. And as you know, my big thing is don't do that prematurely. So I don't know that the elements that we're encountering on the oceans with our military are the same as the element that Valet is imagining as this overarching control system. But whether they are slowly but surely preparing us, perhaps over centuries, right, to eventually acknowledge and recognize their existence, or it's something, and it's much more, big picture, so abstract that we can never see it for what it really is, but it still plays its role of ultimately changing us, managing our evolution, or it's something much more direct, like these craft, these phenomena manifesting out in the oceans, challenging our military. We think again of David Fravor, and one of the things that was amazing about the whole Nimitz Tic Tac thing was that, again, speaking of precognitive sentient phenomena, they knew what the rendezvous point was before it had even been acknowledged, before it had even talked about. So again, when you wrestle with that data point, you say all of our usual ways of studying this scientifically will be challenged, because if you throw out the time and space and the way we think it should roll out, then it really opens up so many new questions, and that should be the fruit for new understandings, for new questions to ask, for new avenues to pursue. We can only hope that that's going to happen. But again, for me, the most intriguing question in the entire phenomenon is it ramping up? Certainly seems like you could argue it is. And if it is, to what end?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. The ways in that it might be provoking us, and I think too, whether I come back to this, whether it's there or not, the moment that we as a species emerged to the point where we looked up and we asked the questions, what is this? What does it mean? These are lures and prompts that continue to propel us forward. And through each new discovery that we make, they add new layers and new reasons for us to make additional discoveries. So it's almost, one could argue that there's this hidden hand, as you said, that this wind, this force that is guiding us in a direction that, intelligent or not, is still at play in our story. And I do wonder, are we coming? Is that coming to a head? Is there a point that we are reaching soon at which our advancement, our behavior, our knowledge is soon intersecting with that other knowledge in a way that we can no longer, kind of skirt past each other, that those boundaries are becoming porous, that they will bleed into each other and become entwined. And what happens then? What happens then as new knowledge is gained and new relationships emerge? What new lures arise in our minds and our lived experience that are going to drive us further? Because it strikes me that it's not going to be this sort of pure one-sided exchange. We're going to get some kind of amazing technology or whatever, and then we're just going to sit on our laurels and use it, and not also want ourselves to make advances or do other things with the discoveries that those technologies provide. So knowledge is a dance, and I would, unless they've discovered all there is to discover, I would like to believe that we're going to add to that overall equation and bring our humanness, our human elements to it in ways that will be incredibly valuable for our human culture. But I would also like to think for the culture of whatever it is that is out there as well.
Yeah, fascinating questions. And, a couple of things come to mind in this. Number one, I recently heard an interview with Gary Nolan where he was talking about, what if it's the case that in ancient history, when our notion, our narrative, our overarching narrative that we use to make sense of the world was that there was these religious figures, right, that ruled the cosmos, then they would manifest as a religious figure, right? Moses on the mountain, or whatever you want to say, and receiving tablets of truth by some sort of mysterious force, that the way that they worked with us then was because that was our expectation, our cultural framing. They gave us what we needed within that frame so we could keep moving forward. And Nolan's point was, in the 21st century, not so many people lean on religion as an overarching narrative structure. But again, we've traded religion for scientism in many ways. We've embraced science. We've embraced technology as a kind of savior. That even the post-humanism movement is all about uploading our consciousness. Even though I think that that's a misnomer, that's a categorical error in what consciousness is. But nevertheless, our expectation now is that the holy grail is technology, right? That's where our expectation is, our excitement is. So now they manifest as technology, as technological devices that intrigue us and titillate us to some degree. That again, it could be that those are the same beings, the same intelligence that manifested as a religious figure or a burning bush is now manifesting as a tic tac. It's worth thinking about. We don't know that. Again, I think to what I said to you last time about the difference between different beings and just the territory, and being part of a multidimensional universe means many different creatures and intelligences will manifest. But we should at least be open to the notion that what if it is an overarching intelligence, and the way they manifest adapts over time to help us move forward in whatever era we are in, and within the framing of whatever our cultural framework is of the time.
Mm-hmm. I want to conclude this episode with, kind of bringing it back to, in a way, where we started, and that's the experience of the individual, and kind of advice that we might give, or ways we might think about our experience of this topic in the moment, and how it's progressing, and our involvement with it on a cognitive level, but an emotional level, a cultural level. And one of the things that I think we really feel strongly about on this show is creating an environment where we can have meaningful, valuable discussion that also kind of elevates and raises our ability to think through these issues and beyond just the surface level. We really want folks to be able to enjoy the pursuit of this topic and all of the kinds of things that it involves, because for me at least, it's incredibly energizing and interesting. Yet at the same time, provide everyone with a toolkit that they can bring to bear on the literature, the experiences, the legislation that is happening, whatever may come from that, the private group exercises that are underway, and whatever revelations may come from those endeavors. Regardless of where the knowledge and information comes from, being able to provide folks with just a language that they can interact with this content that is not one-dimensional. And I think the value of that is that we are not one-dimensional. So, if we are honest with ourselves, everyone who interacts with this subject is going to interact with it in a different way. Some from a very personal place, or they've had a unique experience. Some from a purely sort of cognitive, dry, rational place, and then everything in between. And so if we're going to kind of navigate all of those different things, we really have to find ways in which we can speak to each other, we can relate to each other, that we can think ahead about what this means, not only for ourselves as individuals, but ourselves as a species, as humanity.
Yeah, I think that when we think about the two sort of main frames that we looked at, both the sort of first order effects and the individual elements that play a role, and then the more sort of structural frameworks around us, I think one thing I would suggest to people is to, and this is true of anything in life, but definitely when it comes to the phenomenon, try to develop self awareness. Try to be aware of if something really excites you, if one hypothesis excites you more than another, ask yourself why. Is it really that the data, points in that direction? And or is it also that something about you gets excited about that hypothesis being true over another, and how objective are you being about that? And the process begins with being self-aware and honest with yourself. And it's not that that's a bad thing if you do favor one because you like, you time traveling sounds really cool, so you like that hypothesis more. um, Others want to get outside this about thinking about humanity. They're tired of that anthropocentric kind of mentality, so they want this to be ETs. They want this to be some other planetary civilization, maybe because secretly or only half honestly, half consciously, they think we're going to hell in a handbasket and our civilization needs help. And so they're like, I don't see it coming from a God figure, so I'm going to now ascribe all of my hopes and dreams on some sophisticated alien intelligence coming forward and solving our energy problems and our global warming problems and our warring problems and our worldview warring problems, our culture wars, all of that. So to develop that self-awareness, it's not that you have to, like, we're never going to get to a point where we're completely neutral and just sit and say I don't commit to anything. That can be its own sort of false position. It's okay to have preferences and have reasons for those preferences, but just make them self-aware. Be conscious of them. And when it comes to the different hypotheses and the cultural frameworks piece, I would just say try to make yourself aware of the assumptions behind those hypotheses. What things have to be true at a foundational level for that hypothesis to even be posited as a possibility? Again, a lot of people looking at the ET hypothesis are working with a certain physicalist paradigm. You know that I'm a big fan of metaphysical idealism, this notion that ultimately reality is mind stuff and that matter is sort of an epiphenomena of consciousness. If that's true, how does that change the assumptions? And therefore, how does that change the possibilities? And so to try to be aware on this on a personal level, become self-aware. And when it comes to these hypotheses, be aware of the assumptions that underlie them.
Well said. Well, I really enjoyed this topic. It it doesn't help. It doesn't hurt to have as many tools as you can have and bring those to bear on the subject, and also to really get good at some of them and maybe admit the ones that you're not. That's okay too. We're all going to be, I think, predisposed to being experts in certain areas, and that's why we need each other. That's why this exercise really does involve a group effort, because we each bring something valuable to this endeavor. So I want to say thank you to our listeners who continue to tune in and get something out of the show. And again, we do enjoy the comments and feedback that you leave, and very much look forward to continuing this discussion in the weeks ahead. You can find our show on YouTube at the ExoAcademian YouTube channel, and also under Liminal Frames through, I think, pretty much any podcast platform that you can search under. We're everywhere, and we will continue this conversation and look forward to doing so. So as we close, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.